Your face in the mirror holds the evidence of a migration that covered 5,000 kilometers and took 1,500 generations to complete. The curve of your cheekbone, the fold of your eyelid, the thickness of your hair all trace back to decisions made by people whose names we will never know. Now multiply that mirror by 25 million people living in a single Chinese province, and you begin to understand why Yunnan is the greatest genetic archive East Asia has ever produced. Today we follow the DNA trail that no history book recorded, and what we find at the end will make you look at your own reflection differently. Here is the narrow question that makes this more than just another population genetics story. Yunnan province sits in the far southwest of China, bordered by Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar, with the Tibetan Plateau rising to its north. More than 25 officially recognized ethnic minority groups live there, speaking languages from 4 completely different families: the Bai, the Yi, the Dai, the Hani, the Naxi, the Lisu, the Miao, the Yao, the Zhuang, the Tibetan, the Hua, and then the Han Chinese millions who arrived in waves over centuries. The question is not whether these groups are different from each other. The question is whether their DNA tells a single coherent story, or whether Yunnan is actually several different histories compressed into one geographical space. By the end of this, you will understand why one cave in Yunnan produced a finding so unexpected that it forced archaeologists to rewrite what they thought they knew about the earliest modern humans in East Asia. The popular explanations for Yunnan's diversity have been around for decades, and they feel satisfying in their simplicity. The first explanation says geography did everything. Yunnan is a landscape of deep river valleys, towering mountain ranges, and isolated highland plateaus. The Mekong River cuts through it. The Red River begins there. The Salween carves its eastern edge. When mountains separate villages for centuries, languages and customs diverge, and eventually people look different enough that we call them separate ethnic groups. It is a clean theory, and it is partly right, but it cannot explain why Dai people in Xishuangbanna are genetically closer to Thai people in Bangkok than to their Yi neighbors across the mountains, 1,500 kilometers north versus 50 kilometers east. Geography alone does not make you more related to distant strangers than to your local neighbors. The second explanation says it was all about the Silk Road, or more precisely the Southern Silk Road, the Tea-horse road that connected Yunnan to Tibet and Southeast Asia for more than 1,000 years. Traders moved through, armies moved through, monks moved through, populations mixed. But the mixing we see in the genomes today is far older than the trade routes. The deepest genetic splits among Yunnan populations happened during the Neolithic and Bronze Age, thousands of years before the first tea caravan climbed toward Lhasa. The trade routes accelerated mixing, certainly, but they did not create the underlying pattern. The third popular explanation is the simplest and the most wrong. It says that all these groups are really just branches of a single Chinese family tree, that the minorities are Han Chinese who migrated south at different times and developed different customs. The genetic data kills this idea completely. The Yi people carry a Tibetan Plateau ancestry signal that is almost absent in Han Chinese. The Dai people carry a Southeast Asian ancestry signal that predates the Han expansion by millennia. If Yunnan's ethnic groups were just wandering Han, their genomes would cluster together. They do not. They cluster with populations hundreds or thousands of kilometers away, in completely different directions, and those separations began long before the Han Chinese state existed. The real investigation began in earnest about a decade ago, when advances in ancient DNA sequencing finally made it possible to extract readable genomes from human remains in tropical and subtropical environments. East Asia had been a black hole for ancient DNA because heat and humidity destroy the fragile molecules. Europe and Northern Asia gave up their prehistoric genomes relatively easily. East Asia kept its secrets. A coalition of researchers from Chinese institutions, working with international collaborators from Harvard, the Max Planck Institute, and other centers, began publishing genome-wide data from prehistoric human remains unearthed in Yunnan, Guangxi, and across mainland Southeast Asia. The journal Nature carried several of the key papers, along with Science and Cell, between roughly 2020 and 2023. The scale was unprecedented. Hundreds of ancient individuals, thousands of modern reference genomes from every ethnic group in the region. The method was straightforward in principle. Compare the ancient genomes to each other and to living populations, and map how ancestry percentages shift across time and space. In practice, it was brutal, painstaking work. Many bones yielded nothing. When a usable sequence finally emerged from a set of remains, the researchers describe a moment of suspended breath in the laboratory. One postdoctoral researcher, working on samples from a cave site in Yunnan, reportedly stared at the screen for a full minute after the first quality control metrics came back, then called her supervisor at 11 o'clock at night because she could not wait until morning to confirm that what she was seeing was real. The reason this region stayed unsolved for so long was not just the climate-destroying DNA, it was also the sheer complexity of the population history. When multiple ancestral groups mix, and then those mixed populations mix again, the genetic signal becomes a palimpsest, layer upon layer, and you need both ancient and modern data in huge quantities to separate the layers. For Yunnan, that threshold of data was finally crossed around 2021. The first chapter reveal takes us to the deepest layer, the one that is hardest to see because it has been overlain by everything that came after. Yunnan was not empty when the first farmers arrived. The earliest modern humans in the region belonged to a population of hunter-gatherers whose genetic signature was once widespread across all of mainland Southeast Asia. Archaeologists call the associated stone tool tradition Hoa Binian, named after a site in Vietnam, and its practitioners inhabited the forests and river valleys from southern China down to Sumatra. They have no living descendants who are purely Hoa Binian. Every population in the region today carries them only as a fraction, a ghost percentage, an echo. But that echo is distributed unevenly, and here is the surprising side fact. The modern groups in Yunnan who carry the highest proportion of this deep hunter-gatherer ancestry are not the ones living in the most remote highlands, as you might expect. They are the populations in the southern lowland zones, the Dai, in particular, in Xishuangbanna and Dehong prefectures. Picture a morning in Xishuangbanna, near the Lancang River, which downstream becomes the Mekong. The air is heavy and warm even at dawn. A Dai village wakes to the sound of roosters and the distant hum of long-tail boats on the river. The houses stand on stilts, wood darkened by decades of monsoon rains. An elderly woman sits on her porch, sorting sticky rice into a bamboo basket, her face lined in a pattern that looks, to an untrained eye, exactly like the face of any other grandmother in southern China. But her mitochondrial DNA haplogroup traces back to a lineage that has been in this exact river valley for at least 14,000 years. Far older than rice farming, older than pottery, older than any word we have for China. Two-sided numbers anchor this. In some Dai populations, the Hoa Binian-related ancestry component reaches roughly 20 to 25% of the total genome, depending on which reference panel the researchers use. In the Han Chinese populations of Yunnan, by contrast, that same component sits below 5%. The difference is not subtle. It is the difference between a people whose ancestors have been in place since the Ice Age ended and a people whose ancestors arrived with plows and seed grain. But the hunter-gatherers were not the only ancient population in the region, and what happens when they meet the first farmers changes the genetic landscape of Yunnan permanently. That convergence is where our second chapter begins. When the first rice farmers moved south out of the Yangtze River Valley about 4,000 years ago, they did not find an empty frontier. They found people who had been living there for 10,000 years. The interaction between these two populations, the Yangtze Neolithic rice farmers and the Hoa Binian hunter-gatherers, is written into the genomes of nearly every living person in Yunnan today, but in proportions that tell a complicated and uneven story. The farmers brought not just rice agriculture and domesticated water buffalo, they brought their language as well. The Tai-Kadai language family, which today includes Tai, Lao, Zhuang, and Yunnan's Dai language, originated among those southward-moving Yangtze populations. When linguists first proposed this connection in the late 20th century, they faced resistance because the evidence was indirect, based on reconstructed ancient vocabulary for rice and farming tools. The DNA now confirms it directly. The Dai people of Yunnan carry a dominant Yangtze farming ancestry that links them unmistakably to the early rice cultivators who spread across southern China and into mainland Southeast Asia. And here again, the geography surprises us. The Dai live in the lowland valleys. They grow wet rice in paddies that flood with monsoon water. Their ancestors chose the ecological niche that matched the farming system they already knew. The hunter-gatherers who were there first were pushed or absorbed, retreating into less desirable terrain or intermarrying, until their genetic signal became a minority component in the new agricultural gene pool. A microscene illuminates this process in human terms. About 3,000 years before the present, at a site near what is now the city of Jinghong, A woman was buried in a crouched position with a ceramic pot at her feet and a shell necklace around her neck. Her grave goods mark her as a farmer, culturally Yangtze-derived, but her genome, extracted and analyzed 3,000 years later, tells a different story. She carried about 30% Hoabinian hunter-gatherer ancestry. Her mother's line, her mitochondrial haplogroup, was Hoabinian. Her father's line, her Y chromosome, was Yangtze farmer. A single burial, a single genome, and it captures the entire drama of that ancient encounter in one body. The numbers reinforce the pattern. Across Dai populations, the Yangtze farmer component ranges from about 55 to 70%. In Zhuang populations across the border in Guangxi, it is even higher. In some northern Yunnan groups, it drops below 20%. The southward expansion was not a uniform wave. It was pulses, channels, river valleys, carrying people and their seeds downhill toward the sea. But while the farmers were moving south, something else was moving north, and that something sets up the next chapter in a completely different direction. If you stand in the old town of Lijiang and look north, the mountains rise in tiers toward the Tibetan plateau. The Jade Dragon Snow Mountain dominates the skyline, its peak above 5,000 meters, permanently white against the blue Yunnan sky. The people who live here, the Naxi, and their neighbors the Yi, speak Tibeto-Burman languages, and their faces tend toward the high cheekboned, narrower-eyed morphology, more commonly associated with Tibet and the high Himalaya than with the lowland tropics of Southeast Asia. The genetic reason for this is the third chapter reveal. While the Tai Kadai speakers were spreading south from the Yangtze with their rice paddies, Tibeto-Burman speakers were spreading south from the eastern edge of the Tibetan plateau with their barley, their yaks, and their altitude-adapted blood. The Yi people, who number nearly 10 million and are one of the largest ethnic minorities in China, live scattered across the mountains of Yunnan, Sichuan, and Guizhou. Their genetic profile contains a strong signal of ancestry derived from the ancient populations of the Tibetan plateau, a signal that is absent or minimal in their lowland neighbors. This is not a trace, this is a major component. In some Yi communities, the Tibetan-affiliated ancestry reaches 35 to 40%, depending on the reference panel and the specific village tested. The rest of their genome is a mixture of local Yunnan ancestry and later Han Chinese gene flow. But that Tibetan core is what defines them genetically and, in many ways, culturally. A surprising side fact emerges from the distribution of this ancestry. The signal does not fade gradually with distance from Tibet, as diffusion alone would predict. Instead, it follows the mountain ridges, the Hengduan Range running north to south, like a river of genes flowing downhill between the peaks. The valleys that run east to west, by contrast, form barriers that the Tibeto-Burman migrants were slow to cross. Geography shapes genetics, but it shapes it in channels, not in smooth gradients. Picture a Yi village in the Ilau Mountains, elevation around 2,500 meters. The air is thin. At night, the temperature drops below freezing, even in spring. A young man walks home from the terraced fields where his family grows buckwheat and potatoes, crops that the lowland Dai would not recognize as staples. He passes an old woman wearing an embroidered headdress, heavy silver earrings stretching her lobes, her face weathered by sun and cold. Her EPAS1 gene carries a variant that helps her blood produce more oxygen-carrying red blood cells at high altitude, the same variant that evolution selected for in Tibetans thousands of years ago. Her ancestors did not originate on this mountain. They came from higher up, from the plateau, and their bodies still carry the engineering for an altitude they no longer live in. The numbers tell the story of two migrations colliding in one province. In Naxi and Yi populations, northern Tibeto-Burman ancestry sits at roughly 25 to 45%. In Bai populations around Dali, it drops to 10 to 20%, because the Bai have absorbed a much larger Han Chinese contribution. In the Dai, it is negligible. 3 different genetic trajectories, 3 different histories, all within a few hundred kilometers of each other. But the Naxi and Yi are not the most genetically surprising Tibeto-Burman group in Yunnan. That distinction belongs to a smaller population whose DNA points toward an even more ancient and isolated migration, one that may predate the main Tibeto-Burman expansion entirely. The Hani people number about 1.5 million, concentrated in the Honghe prefecture of southern Yunnan, famous for their rice terraces that cascade down the mountain slopes in steps so numerous that if you laid them end to end, they would stretch for thousands of kilometers. The Hani speak a Tibeto-Burman language, And for a long time, anthropologists assumed they were simply a southern branch of the Yi, closely related, a linguistic offshoot that had drifted downhill into lower elevations over the centuries. The genomes told a different story. When researchers compared Hani DNA to Yi DNA, they found that the Hani carried a much larger proportion of the ancient local Yunnan ancestry, the pre-farming hunter-gatherer component that had been partially absorbed by the Hoabinian populations to the south. But unlike the Dai, who mixed with Hoabinian populations in the lowlands, the Hani's ancient local ancestry appears to come from a completely different hunter-gatherer group, one native to the highland forests of central Yunnan, rather than the tropical river valleys of the south. The genetic distance between a Hani individual and a Yi individual is not trivial. It is comparable to the distance between a Norwegian and a Northern Italian in European terms. Two Tibeto-Burman speaking groups, two sets of mountain farming communities, two completely different population histories. A microscene from a Hani village near Yuanyang captures the paradox. A family sits on the edge of their rice terrace, eating lunch from bamboo containers. The terrace is descending below them in green steps toward a valley floor hidden in mist. The grandmother tells her grandchildren a story about how the Hani came to this place from a cold land, far to the north, crossing mountains and rivers for generations, until they found this valley. Her mtDNA, if she were tested, would show that part of the story is true. Her deep maternal lineage does trace north, toward the Tibetan fringe. But the rest of her genome, the autosomal DNA, would reveal that her ancestors also include people who had been living in these mountains long before the northern migration arrived, people whose names her grandmother's grandmother never heard, people whose entire cultural memory has been erased except for the silent persistence of their genes. The numbers quantify this layering. Hani populations show about 15 to 25% highland hunter-gatherer ancestry, a component that is distinct from the Hoabinian signal in the Dai. Their Tibeto-Burman northern ancestry sits at 30 to 40%. The rest is a mixture of Yangtze farmer, Han Chinese, and smaller contributions that different studies classify in different ways. The picture is not a simple two-way mix. It is a three-way, four-way, sometimes five-way blend, and untangling it required the ancient DNA reference sequences without which none of this would have been visible. But the next chapter introduces a group whose entire genetic identity was shaped by political integration rather than ancient migration, and their story reveals how recent history can reshape genomes just as dramatically as prehistoric expansions. Dali sits on the western shore of Erhai Lake, a long, narrow body of water cradled between mountain ranges, its shores dotted with white-walled villages and Buddhist temples. The Bai people have lived here for at least 2,000 years. They established the Nanzhao Kingdom in the 8th century, a powerful state that rivaled Tang Dynasty China and controlled territory stretching into what is now Myanmar and northern Vietnam. The Bai are not a small group. They number nearly 2 million. Their language is Tibeto-Burman, but their genetic profile is like nothing else in Yunnan. When geneticists ran the numbers, they discovered that the Bai carry a roughly 40 to 60% contribution from Han Chinese populations, a signal that is far stronger in the Bai than in the Yi, the Naxi, or the Hani. This was not an ancient Neolithic input. It was a relatively recent infusion, concentrated in the last 1,000 years, after the Mongol conquest of Dali in 1253, as Han soldiers, merchants, and farmers moved into the region under the Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties. The Bai did not disappear as a people. They absorbed the newcomers, gradually, over centuries, until the Han genetic contribution became so large that it now rivals the Bai's own pre-Han ancestry. A surprising side fact sharpens this picture. Despite the overwhelming Han genetic input, the Bai retained their language and their cultural identity. Their genetic alteration did not erase their ethnic distinctiveness. It simply changed the biological foundation underneath it, and the contrast with the Dai on one side and the Yi on the other could not be more striking. The Dai preserved genetic continuity with ancient Yangtze farmers. The Yi preserved genetic continuity with ancient Tibetans. The Bai absorbed a foreign population so completely that half their genome now comes from it, and yet they remain unmistakably Bai. Stand on the shore of Erhai Lake at sunset. The water is silver, the mountains black silhouettes against an orange sky. A Bai fisherman pulls his net from the lake, the same way his ancestors did for centuries. But his face, his hands, his bone structure. He shares with a Han Chinese merchant in Kunming more than he shares with a Yi herder in the mountains 50 kilometers west. Two-sided numbers. A Bai individual and a Han individual from Yunnan might share 50% of their ancestry. A Bai individual and a Yi individual might share only 20%. Geography betrays you here. The Yi live closer to Dali than the Han population centers in eastern Yunnan. Proximity is not kinship. History is kinship, and the history that reshaped the Bai genome was not a migration of tribes in the Bronze Age. It was an empire, a bureaucracy, a road system, a tax register, centuries of intermarriage between Han officials and local Bai elites, recorded in marriage documents and later in genetics. But the Bai are not the only group in Yunnan whose DNA tells a story of recent admixture, and the next chapter turns to populations whose genetic history is even more compressed, communities whose ancestors arrived not thousands of years ago, but within the last few centuries. The Hui Muslims of Yunnan, like the Bai, number close to 1 million people. They are scattered across the province, with major communities in Kunming, Dali, and smaller towns along the old trade routes. Their origin story is entirely different from every other group we have discussed so far. The Hui trace their ancestry to Muslim merchants and soldiers who entered China during the Mongol Yuan dynasty, mostly from Central Asia and Persia. Men who married local Han women and established communities that preserved Islam while adopting Chinese language and many Chinese customs. Genetically, the Hui are fascinating because they represent a controlled experiment in population mixing within a known historical time frame. The Central Asian input arrived starting in the 13th century, peaking in the 14th, and then, because the Hui largely married within their own religious community thereafter, the Central Asian signal was preserved rather than diluted. When researchers sequenced Yunnan Hui genomes and compared them to Han Chinese and Central Asian reference populations, they found that the Hui carry roughly 10 to 15% Western Eurasian ancestry, a percentage that varies by individual and by community. In some Hui villages that maintain stricter endogamy, the percentage rises higher. In more integrated urban Hui populations in Kunming, it drops. The diaspora is recent, its genetic fingerprint still sharp and measurable, and it is a reminder that Yunnan's genetic diversity is not only an ancient story, it is still being written. A micro-scene. A Hui family in the old city of Dali runs a halal beef noodle shop, their grandfather's grandfather's grandfather having come from Bukhara, in what is now Uzbekistan, 7 centuries ago. The shop does not look different from the Han noodle shop next door, except for the Arabic calligraphy on the wall and the absence of pork on the menu. A teenage daughter, scrolling her phone behind the counter while customers eat, has no idea she carries a Y chromosome haplogroup that peaks in Kazakhstan, and an autosome that is 85% Han Chinese. She is Yunnanese. She is Hui. She is a living record of the Mongol Empire. The final chapter reveal introduces a genetic thread that ties multiple Yunnan populations together in a way that has nothing to do with ancestry proportions and everything to do with evolution. The EPAS1 gene, which we mentioned earlier in the context of the Yi, is one of the best studied examples of human adaptation to high altitude. The Tibetan version of this gene, inherited from Denisovans, allows people to live above 4,000 meters without developing the dangerously thickened blood that afflicts lowlanders who try to do the same. The allele frequency of this variant in Yunnan peaks in the northwestern prefectures, near the Tibetan border, in populations like the Nakshi and some Yi communities, where it can reach 10 to 15%. That is lower than in Tibet proper, where it sometimes exceeds 70%. But it is far higher than in lowland groups like the Dai or the Han. This genetic gradient is a map of altitude adaptation retreating as elevation drops, and it links the Tibeto-Burman populations of Yunnan directly to their plateau origins. But what makes this a surprising side fact rather than just a confirmation of what we already knew is that some Hani populations, living at relatively low elevations, also carry the EPAS1 variant at detectable frequencies. They live at 1,500 meters, not 4,000, and yet their bodies still hold the genetic memory of higher ground. The altitude adaptation has persisted at least 3,000 or 4,000 years after their ancestors descended into the valleys, a biological inertia that tells you how strong the selective pressure was that created it. Natural selection does not erase a beneficial gene just because you move downhill. It simply stops maintaining it, and it decays slowly across millennia. In the Hani, it is still decaying, still present, still traceable. Now the forward tease takes us to the edge of the answer. All these migrations, all these admixtures, all these adaptations, converge on a single question that remains unresolved. When and where did the deepest branch of the East Asian family tree split? And what did the people on that earliest branch look like? The evidence that answers that question was waiting in a cave in Yunnan, and someone had already dug it up decades ago. The narrowing begins with a single site, Red Deer Cave, Maludong, in Yunnan's Mengzi County. Excavated in the 1980s and 2000s, the cave yielded human remains that confused everyone. The skulls were odd. They had thick brow ridges, flat faces, broad noses, small chins. Some features looked archaic, almost like Homo erectus. Other features looked modern. The bones dated to around 14,000 years before the present, which meant these people lived at the same time as fully modern humans everywhere else in the world. For years, a minority of paleoanthropologists argued that the Red Deer Cave people might be a surviving archaic human species, a relict population that had persisted in the isolation of Yunnan's mountains long after their kind had gone extinct everywhere else. The debate was heated. The bones were fragmentary. No DNA could be extracted at first. The mystery sat unresolved for a decade. Then extraction technology improved. The core answer is this. In the early 2020s, a team of geneticists finally sequenced DNA from the Red Deer Cave remains. The genome came out clean. It was not archaic. It was not a new species. The Red Deer Cave people were modern Homo sapiens, belonging to a deep East Asian lineage that is closely related to the ancestors of all living East Asians. Their unusual skull features were within the range of normal human variation, not evidence of a hybrid or a holdover from an earlier human type. The mystery was solved. The people who looked different were not different in the way that mattered. Their genes placed them squarely on the East Asian branch of the human family tree, with no closer affinity to Denisovans or Neanderthals than any other East Asian population. The strange anatomy was a false lead. The DNA was the truth. But this answer, as satisfying as it is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a larger revelation that reframes everything we understand about Yunnan's place in human prehistory. The twist is not that the Red Deer Cave people were modern. The twist is what their genome revealed about the structure of the East Asian family tree itself. When the researchers placed the Red Deer Cave genome into the context of all available ancient and modern East Asian populations, they discovered something that had been suspected but never proven. The deep East Asian lineage that the Red Deer Cave people belonged to split from the main East Asian trunk significantly earlier than the split between northern and southern East Asians. This means that the Red Deer Cave genome represents a branch that diverged before the ancestors of the Han, the Dai, the Yi, the Naxi, and every other group in Yunnan separated from each other. In the family tree of East Asian humanity, the Red Deer Cave people are not on any of the major branches we recognize today. They are on a branch that grows directly out of the trunk, below the point where the known branches fork. This makes them invaluable. They are a window into the ancestral population that gave rise to all East Asians, a population whose genome had never been directly sampled before. The implications are enormous and unexpected. It means that Yunnan was not merely a crossroads where already differentiated populations met and mixed. Yunnan, or at least the region that includes it, may have been one of the places where the deepest differentiation of the East Asian lineage occurred. The diversity we see in Yunnan today is not just the result of later migrations converging on a neutral territory. It is layered on top of deep diversity that already existed in the area, diversity that traces back to the very earliest days of modern humans in Asia. The Red Deer Cave genome is the smoking gun for the claim that the roots of East Asian genetic variation are far older and far more geographically structured than the simple north-south split model had suggested. The ancient crossroads was ancient all the way down. Independent confirmation of this picture comes not from ancient DNA, not from bones, but from a completely different category of evidence: linguistics. The language families spoken in Yunnan today do not just happen to be diverse. They represent three of the major language families of East and Southeast Asia, and their distributions map almost perfectly onto the genetic clines we have discussed. The Tibeto-Burman languages of the Yi, Naxi, Hani, and Bai cluster in the highlands and share deep roots with languages spoken on the Tibetan Plateau. The Tai-Kadai languages of the Dai and Zhuang cluster in the lowlands and share roots with Tai and Lao. The Hmong-Mien languages of the Miao and Yao form their own distinct group, with their own genetic correlation that we have not even had time to discuss fully. This is not a coincidence. Languages do not travel without people. The fact that language families in Yunnan correspond to distinct genetic ancestries, each with its own geographic trajectory and its own archaeological signature, confirms that the genetic patterns are real and that they represent genuine population movements, not statistical artifacts or sampling biases. Moreover, the time depths estimated from linguistic divergence between the Tai-Kadai and Tibeto-Burman families are consistent with the archaeological dates for the Neolithic expansions that the genetics identifies. The farming dispersal of Tai-Kadai speakers from the Yangtze. The highland dispersal of Tibeto-Burman speakers from the Tibetan fringe. Two independent lines of evidence, using completely different data and methods, converge on the same historical narrative. When independent evidence converges, the hypothesis graduates from plausible to probable. The mechanism behind these patterns is written into specific genes that we can now name and count. The EPOS1 gene we have already discussed, its altitude variant originating in Denisovans, introgressing into the ancestors of Tibetans around 40,000 years ago, and then being carried southward into Yunnan by Tibeto-Burman migrants. The allele frequency of this variant in highland Yunnan populations around 10 to 15%, compared to near zero in lowland groups and over 70% in some Tibetan populations, maps a selective gradient. Natural selection favors the variant at high altitude. It is neutral at low altitude. As the Tibeto-Burman speakers descended, the allele frequency dropped in every generation because the selective pressure was removed. But it drops slowly, and the current frequencies tell you roughly how many generations have passed since the descent. The EDAR gene, known for influencing hair thickness, sweat gland density, and tooth shape, shows a different pattern. Its East Asian-specific variant is present at high frequency across all Yunnan populations, including the Tibetan ancestry groups and the Hobinian-descended Dai. This means the EDAR variant was already fixed or nearly fixed in the common East Asian ancestral population before any of the Yunnan subpopulations diverged, which constrains the timing of its spread to the period before the deepest splits in the East Asian tree. The Red Deer Cave genome, if its EDAR status could be checked, would help confirm whether the variant was already present in the ancestral East Asian population 14,000 years ago. Lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, is rare in all Yunnan populations, consistent with the absence of a pastoralist tradition in East Asia, and contrasting sharply with European and some African populations. These three genes alone, EPAS1 for altitude, EDAR for East Asian morphology, and lactase for diet, trace the major selective forces that shaped Yunnan bodies. Both sides stated. The altitude-adapted EPAS1 variant was an advantage in the highlands and a neutral passenger in the lowlands. The EDAR variant was apparently advantageous everywhere in East Asia, perhaps for sweat gland function or hair protection in a humid environment. The lactase non-persistence allele was the ancestral state, and without a strong dairy pastoralist culture, there was never any pressure to change it. Here is what the evidence does not prove, and it matters to say this plainly. The genetic data does not give us exact dates for most of the migration events. It gives us statistical windows, and those windows are wide. When we say the Tibeto-Burman speakers entered Yunnan roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, the uncertainty is plus or minus 1,000 years or more. The exact routes of migration are inferred, not observed. We know the Yi carry Tibetan Plateau ancestry, but we cannot pinpoint the specific valleys and passes their ancestors walked. The Red Deer Cave genome is a single data point. It tells us that a deep lineage lived in Yunnan 14,000 years ago. But it does not tell us whether that lineage was widespread or isolated, whether it contributed ancestry to living people or went extinct without issue. The percentages we have quoted for ancestry components depend on reference populations and statistical models, and different models give different numbers. The broad pattern is robust. The fine details are uncertain. Science is the process of reducing uncertainty, not eliminating it. Now bring this home to your own face in the mirror. The fold of your eyelid, the shape of your cheekbone, the thickness of your hair shaft. If you have East Asian ancestry, the EDAR variant that shapes those features was selected for in a population that lived somewhere in East Asia tens of thousands of years ago. Perhaps in a place not unlike Yunnan, where multiple environments pressed on human bodies and rewarded those who adapted. If your ancestors came from somewhere else entirely, the same principle applies with different genes and different environments. Your face is a map of ancient migrations, just as much as the face of the Dai grandmother in Xishuangbanna or the Yi herder in the Ailao Mountains. The difference is only that in Yunnan, The migrations happened to converge from so many directions that the province became a compressed atlas of half of Asia. The Dai show us the path of rice farmers from the Yangtze into the tropics. The Yi show us the path of high-altitude people from the plateau into the mountains. The Bai show us the path of imperial integration and genetic absorption. The Hui show us the path of medieval global trade. The Red Deer Cave people show us the deepest branch of all, the trunk of the East Asian tree before any of the branches we know had separated. Tracking the DNA of Yunnan is not a study of one province. It is a study of how human populations move, mix, and adapt everywhere, made visible because Yunnan's geography trapped and preserved the evidence in a way that flatter, simpler landscapes did not. Your ancestors did the same thing, somewhere, sometime. Your genome is a compressed history book too. So the next time you look in the mirror, ask yourself this specific question. Which of your ancestors walked the longest migration, and what did that migration force them to become? Tell us in the comments.